The story tells us that the first thing a person of faith should do when they wake up is pray. Open your eyes, thank God, start the day right. That is what we are taught in one form or another, whether we grew up in a church, a mosque, or nowhere near either. It sounds complete. It sounds like the whole instruction. King Solomon, the man this channel is named for, the man the Talmud itself calls the wisest to ever live, would tell you that story is missing its first and most important page. I have been sitting with this for weeks, and I want to show you why. Before we go further, if this is the kind of thing that pulls at you, the ancient instructions nobody teaches anymore, the parts of the old texts that got quietly left out of the modern version of faith, it is worth subscribing now. The platform only keeps showing this kind of research to people who tell it they want more. And what comes in the next few minutes is the part most viewers tell me they were not ready to hear. Let me tell you what I found, because it starts with a question I imagine some of you have asked in the dark, at 4 a.m, without saying it out loud to anyone. Am I doing this wrong? Or is God simply not listening to my morning prayers? Maybe you have felt that specific heavy dread of opening your eyes before sunrise, a weight pressing down on your chest that has no name, like something is sitting on you before your feet even touch the floor. Maybe you have scrolled past a dozen videos of other people's perfect morning routines, candles lit, journals open, and quietly concluded that you were simply not given the discipline gene, that the failure is yours. I want to tell you as clearly as I can that none of those three things are the real problem. Not one of them. The real problem is that you were handed half of an instruction and told it was the whole thing. Here is the official story, the one you already know, whether you have ever articulated it or not. You wake up. At some point, ideally soon, you pray. The order after that does not matter much. Coffee, phone, shower, breakfast, it is all just the logistics of a day that has already, technically, started right. This is the version everyone accepts, because nobody ever offered an alternative. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like something any sensible person raised in any tradition would not belong to. But when you look at what the actual sources say, the ones I have spent 12 years chasing through monastery archives and university basements, the story falls apart in a very specific way. It is not that prayer in the morning is wrong. It is that prayer in the old instruction was never meant to be the first act. It was meant to be the second, sometimes the third. And what comes before it is the part that has been erased so completely that most people alive today have never heard of it, even though it was, according to the text itself, praised by a voice from heaven. I need to take you back for a moment, because this is not abstract to me. This is personal, and it starts in a kitchen in Nsukka, in Igbo land, where I was born. My mother would not let me touch my own face when I woke up. She would not let me pick up a spoon, open a door, or greet my sisters until I had washed my hands. I used to think this was simply about hygiene, the ordinary caution of a mother raising children in a house without modern plumbing close by. But she said something to me once. When I was maybe 7 years old, reaching for a piece of bread before I had gone to the basin, she grabbed my wrist, not roughly but firmly, the way you stop a child from touching a hot stove, and she said, in Igbo, that what slept with you all night is still stuck to your fingers. She never explained further. She did not need to. In her mind, it was simply the rule of the house. I did not think about that sentence again for almost 30 years, not until I was standing in a cold reading room in an Ethiopian monastery, holding a manuscript so old the ink had gone the color of rust, and reading a description of the first gestures of the day, the ones performed before a single word is spoken, as the determining factor in whether that day is born, as the text put it, sealed or open to intrusion. I sat with that word for a long time. Sealed. Open to intrusion. That is not the language of hygiene. That is the language of a door. And here is where it gets strange, Because this was not an isolated tradition. Years earlier, in my own studies at SOAS in London, a professor had shown me a Babylonian ritual text, thousands of years older than anything Jewish, describing an almost identical morning sequence, hands first, before anything else touches the body. He was not a religious man. He showed it to me as a curiosity, an anthropological footnote, but it planted something in me that would not leave. If the same instinct appears in Babylon, in Ethiopia, in my mother's kitchen in Nasuka, separated by oceans and thousands of years, with no possible contact between them, then we are not looking at a cultural habit. We are looking at something closer to a universal recognition, something that kept surfacing because it kept being true. So let us descend into the first layer, the one that changes the shape of the whole story. But wait, that is not the worst part. The first layer is this: the instruction to wash your hands immediately upon waking, before touching your face, before speaking, before praying, is not a folk customs that got attached to religion later. It is written directly into the Talmud, and it is not attributed to an anonymous rabbi or an unnamed sage. In Tractates Eruvin, and again in Tractates Shabbat, the institution of this practice, called Netilat Yadayim, the ritual washing of the hands, is credited by name to King Solomon himself. Not a suggestion he might have followed, an institution he created as an extension of the purity laws that governed the priests of the temple, brought down out of the sanctuary and placed into the ordinary bedroom of an ordinary person. And the text goes further than simply recording this as fact. It says that for this act, a heavenly voice praised his wisdom. Sit with that for a second. Of everything Solomon is remembered for, the wealth, the wisdom, the 1,000 proverbs, the temple he built, this is one of the specific acts singled out for praise from heaven. Not a grand gesture, a private one, something done alone in the dark, before anyone else is awake to see it. That is the first crack in the official story. Prayer was never demoted, but it was never meant to stand alone at the front of the line either. Something was supposed to come first. And if you have spent years grabbing your phone the second your eyes open, the way almost everyone in this generation does, some part of you already suspected that the very first gesture of your day carries a kind of weight the rest of your morning does not. Now think about this carefully, because the second layer is where the story stops being about ritual order and starts being about something considerably heavier. Why hands? Why not the face, which touches the pillow all night? Why not the feet, which touch the floor? Why this specific, almost obsessive focus on the hands in Babylon, in Zuka, in the Talmud, all pointing at the same part of the body? The answer sent me back into Jewish mysticism, into a text called the Zohar. And I will be honest with you, the first time I read this passage, I did not sleep well that night. The Zohar describes sleep itself, the actual state of unconsciousness you enter every single night, as 1/60th of death. Not a metaphor for death, a fraction of it, a measurable increment of the same category of thing. During that state, the text says, the holy soul partially departs the body, and something is left behind to occupy the vacancy. The text calls it ruach ra'ah, an impure spirit, a residue, and it says this residue specifically lingers on the hands upon waking, because the hands are what remain active, in a sense, closest to the boundary between the sleeping body and the world it is about to re-enter. This is where I have to be honest with you about something in my own life, because I do not think I can explain why this hit me the way it did without it. For years in my 20s and into my 30s, I struggled with waking between 3 and 5 in the morning, with a crushing, wordless dread sitting on my chest. Unable to move, unable to name what I was afraid of. My father, the historian, called it stress. A doctor once suggested it was a sleep disorder, and clinically, he may not have been wrong, But when I read that passage in the Zohar describing sleep as a partial death, and the hands as the last place the impurity of that state clings before the day begins, something in me recognized it, the way you recognize a word in a language you did not know you spoke. I am still not entirely sure what to make of that recognition. But I know this: the ancient text was not ignorant of the physical experience of waking up heavy and afraid. It named it directly, centuries before anyone had a clinical term for it. And it did not treat the feeling as something to simply endure or medicate into silence. It treated it as something to seal. That is the second layer, and it should feel heavier than the first, because it is. The first layer told you an act was missing from the order of your morning. The second layer tells you why the order matters as much as it does. You are not waking up neutral. According to this tradition, you're waking up from a nightly rehearsal of death, with something still resting on the part of your body, most likely to touch your face, your food, your children, your prayers in the next few minutes. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. If that is true, then reaching for your phone first, before washing, before a single sealing word, is not a modern bad habit. It is, in the language of this tradition, touching the world and letting the world touch you back before you have closed the door behind you. I want to slow down on that phrase, 1/60th of death, because it is easy to let it pass as poetry and miss what it is actually claiming. The rabbis who used that fraction were not being decorative. They were placing sleep on a scale, with full waking life at one end and death itself at the other, and saying that ordinary sleep sits far enough along that scale to share in its nature, not merely resemble it. That is a claim about substance, not mood. It means the body you wake up in every single morning has, in a small but real measure, already crossed a threshold most people assume only happens once, at the very end of a life. And it crosses back every day, which is precisely why the tradition treats the return, the waking itself, as something requiring a deliberate, structured re-entry, rather than the instant, unthinking scroll through a phone that most of us default to now. Consider what that reframes. The exhaustion so many people describe upon waking, the sense that rest never truly restores them no matter how many hours they slept, is treated in the old sources not as a failure of sleep hygiene, but as an incomplete crossing back. You went out to the edge described as 1/60th of death, and you did not seal the return before the world rushed in through your fingertips and your phone screen. The tiredness was never only physical. According to this tradition, it was structural. A door left ajar. Let us go to what nobody actually says out loud, even in the communities that still practice this. This is the part that took me the longest to accept, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because I do not think it is fair to just drop it on you. The 7 minutes are not about hygiene, and they are not, despite how modern content likes to package this, about optimizing your morning or building a habit of successful people. I want to be direct with you. If you came here expecting a productivity hack dressed up in old language, that is not what this is, and I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. What the old sources describe is closer to something you might call spiritual architecture. Each specific gesture in those first minutes is not a task to check off. It is a door being closed one at a time on a very specific kind of vulnerability, before that vulnerability has a chance to attach itself to the rest of your day. The Talmud in Tractate Berakhot lays out an entire structure of blessings called the Berakhot HaShacher, the morning blessings, and describes them as a precise sequence of gesture and word designed for one purpose: acknowledging that the soul has been returned, restored from what the tradition calls a state of semi-death, and sealing the transition from that vulnerable, dormant state into spiritual readiness. Not gratitude in the abstract sense we usually mean when we say the word, a structural transition, a locking mechanism, and centuries later, Maimonides, in his great legal code, the Mishneh Torah, in the section on the laws of prayer, codified the exact sequence of these morning physical actions, the washing, the dressing, the first steps taken, and linked each one to specific verbal blessings. He was not describing two separate categories of behavior, a physical routine and a spiritual practice running in parallel. He described one system, gesture and word, working as a single mechanism, each incomplete without the other. Here is the nucleus of everything I have been circling around, and it is the part that changes how you should hear everything I have said so far. The reason your morning prayers sometimes feel like they are hitting the ceiling, the reason you go through the motions of devotion and feel nothing on the other end, dry, disconnected, going through a script that used to mean something, may not be a failure of your faith at all. It may be a failure of sequence. You are speaking to God before you have closed the door the tradition tells you to close first. You are trying to have a conversation in a room where the previous occupant never actually left. Come back for a second to that opening line. The story tells us that the first thing a person of faith should do when they wake up is pray. Now you can see what that sentence was actually hiding. It was not wrong that prayer matters. It was wrong about what prayer is supposed to walk into. A sealed room, according to this tradition, not an open one. The official version left out the door entirely and then wondered, along with you, why the room on the other side sometimes feels so empty. I want to give you something here that I have never told on this channel before. Something I only pieced together this year, going through boxes in my father's old study near Oxford after he passed. My father was the strict rationalist in our house, the historian at UCL, who spent 40 years quietly dismissing what he considered my mother's superstitions, including, more than once at the dinner table, in front of me, the ritual she insisted on every single morning. He used to say that washing your hands before touching your face was, in his words, nothing more than medieval hygiene dressed up as theology, a survival habit from an age without medicine that religion later claimed credit for. I believed him for a long time. It was easier, frankly, to believe the version that required nothing of me. This year, going through his papers, I found a small worn notebook I never knew existed, tucked behind a row of journals on Second Temple history. In it, in his own handwriting, was a translation he had done privately, decades ago, of a passage from Tractates Shabbat. 14b, the very passage that attributes Netilat Yadayim to Solomon. In the margin, in ink that had faded to almost nothing, he had written a single line, undated, that I do not believe he ever showed to anyone. It said, roughly translated from his shorthand, that a wise man built a wall around an act too easily dismissed as small, knowing the wall would outlast every argument made against it. I sat on the floor of his study for a long time after reading that. My father, who had spent 40 years telling me this was nothing, had privately translated the very text that proved it was something and said nothing. I do not know if it was pride or doubt, or simply the particular loneliness of a rationalist who found something he could not fully explain away. I do not think I will ever fully understand that silence, but I know what it did to me, reading it. It closed a distance in my own family that I did not know was still open. My mother's kitchen rule and my father's private hidden translation turned out to be describing the exact same door. Ask yourself this tonight, or better, ask yourself tomorrow morning, the moment you wake up. What is the very first thing your hand reaches for? For most people watching this, if you are honest, it is a phone on a nightstand before your eyes have even fully adjusted to the light. According to everything we have just walked through, that is not a small habit. That is the residue of the night still on your fingers. And the first thing you are doing with it is opening a door to the entire noise of the world before you have closed the one behind you. This is what it means for you, specifically, in your own bedroom, tomorrow. Not someday, tomorrow. The sources describe roughly 7 minutes, broken into a small number of deliberate movements, and I want to walk you through them the way the old texts intend them to be understood, not as a checklist, but as a sealing, minute by minute. The first minute belongs to the hands. Before your eyes fully adjust to the light in the room, before your feet touch the floor, before you reach for anything at all, this is the moment the Talmud and the Zohar both point to. The hands, having rested closest to the boundary of that 60th of death state all night, are the first thing addressed. Not because they are dirty in the way we usually mean the word, but because they are the last point of contact with the vulnerability of sleep. By the seal of Solomon, I seal my hands. The residue of the night does not travel with me into this day. The second minute belongs to the first word, not a scroll through notifications, not a name called out to another person in the house, not even, according to this structure, the full formal prayer yet. The first word is short, deliberate, and it acknowledges the simple, staggering fact that you have been returned from that partial death into a functioning body and a working mind. This is the Berakhot Hashachar the Talmud describes in Berakhot 60b, the sequence of blessings built for exactly this moment. By the seal of Solomon, I seal my first word, so that what leaves my mouth this morning belongs to gratitude before it belongs to noise. The third minute belongs to the feet, the first steps taken across the floor of the room. Maimonides, writing centuries later in the Mishneh Torah, linked these physical steps directly to blessing, treating the literal walking of the body as inseparable from the spiritual state of the person walking. Not two systems running side by side. One system. By the seal of Solomon, I seal my steps so that the direction I move in this morning is chosen, not stumbled into. Each of these is a door. Hands, word, steps. Each one closes a specific point where the vulnerability of sleep could otherwise follow you into the daylight. This is not a productivity framework, and it will not organize your calendar for you. It was never meant to. It was meant to seal you specifically against something the old texts were far more precise about than we tend to be today. I want to add something here that took me years of fieldwork to fully appreciate, because the order of these three seals is not arbitrary, and once you see the logic behind it, you cannot unsee it. Notice that the hands come before the word, and the word comes before the steps. That is not simply the order your body happens to move in as you get out of bed. It mirrors almost exactly the order the priests of the Jerusalem temple were required to follow before service. Purification of the hands first, then the spoken blessing, then the physical entry into the sanctuary itself. Maimonides was not inventing a convenient morning checklist when he wrote this into the Mishneh Torah. He was quietly transplanting temple procedure into the bedroom of every ordinary person, so that an act once reserved for priests standing before an altar became available to anyone standing beside their own bed. That is what the Talmud means when it says Solomon extended the purity laws of the temple into daily life. It is not a loose comparison. It is the same sequence, scaled down, made portable, and handed to you. Once you notice that, the 7 minutes stop looking like a folk custom that happened to survive and start looking like something closer to inherited infrastructure, a piece of temple architecture still standing, quietly, inside an instruction most people now perform without knowing what building it was originally designed for. I know some of you are sitting with a very reasonable objection right now, and I want to meet it directly rather than pretend it does not exist. Because Solomon deserves better than blind acceptance, and so do you. Someone will say there is no explicit biblical command about a 7-minute morning routine, and that this is simply modern self-help wearing the costume of religion. I understand why that suspicion exists. We are drowning in content that does exactly that. But the 7 minutes is a modern pacing framework laid over something considerably older. The sequence of gestures themselves, the hand washing specifically, is not modern at all. It sits in the Talmudic Tractates Eruvin and Shabbat, compiled around 1500 years ago, explicitly crediting the institution to Solomon's wisdom as an extension of duties that once belonged only to the priests of the temple. Someone else will say that waking up feeling heavy or paralyzed is simply sleep paralysis, a documented medical phenomenon, not the residue of an impure spirit. And I will not stand here and dismiss the science, because I do not think the old tradition would want me to. Ancient Jewish mysticism already recognized the physiological reality that sleep is an extreme form of dormancy, calling it, in its own words, a taste of death. The ritual of Netilat Yadayim was built to address both realities at once, the physical transition of the waking body and the spiritual need to intentionally seal it against that lingering heaviness. This was never physiology against theology. It was always physiology alongside theology in the same sentence. And someone will say fairly bluntly that this just sounds like religious branding stapled onto trendy morning routine content, that waking up early and washing your hands is modern productivity culture wearing an old costume. I would ask that person to check the dates. Maimonides codified this sequence in the 12th century. The Talmud recorded the attribution to Solomon around 500 of the Common Era. Both predate any modern productivity book by well over 1,000 years. The chronology runs backward from what the skeptic assumes. This gesture does not organize your schedule. It seals your body against a vulnerability the text itself calls spiritual. Centuries before anyone tried to sell you a morning routine on a screen. There is a story a stranger once shared, one of thousands of similar accounts scattered across forums and message boards from people who tried this without any of the mysticism I have just walked you through, simply as an experiment. A person described years of morning anxiety, waking already bracing for the day, reaching first for their phone the way almost all of us do now. They tried on a whim, treating their own bedroom the way you might treat a small temple, and their own first waking gesture, the hands, as an act of purification rather than routine. They did not report a miracle. They reported something quieter, and, I think, more believable. A years-long cycle of morning dread beginning, slowly, to loosen, not because a phone stopped existing in the room, but because something was closed before it was allowed back in. I want to be careful here, because this is not a promise, and Solomon's wisdom was never sold as a guarantee. This is not a cure, and I am not telling you that 3 minutes of ritual will erase clinical anxiety or resolve what a doctor should also be looking at. What I'm telling you is that the sequence you are about to hear was built across 3 separate ancient civilizations that never spoke to one another, around a single shared intuition, that the first minutes after waking are not neutral, and that something small, done with attention, in silence, before the noise of the world reaches your hands, changes what kind of day you are walking into. This is what settles in me now, more than anything else I found in 12 years of archives. The problem was never that you lacked discipline. The problem was never that your prayers were somehow too weak to reach anywhere. You were simply speaking into a room before you had sealed the door behind you. Think about what that actually undoes if you let it. Every morning, you have quietly judged yourself for failing at discipline. Every scroll through someone else's candlelit, journal-filled routine that made you feel like you were missing some gene for spiritual seriousness. Every time you assumed the silence on the other end of your prayer meant God had simply stopped listening to you specifically. None of that was ever the diagnosis this tradition would have given you. Not laziness, not a deficit of faith. A door left open, 3 specific gestures away from being closed. The same 3 gestures a king once performed alone, in the dark, before anyone was awake to call it impressive. And I think that is the part worth sitting with longest. Solomon did not seal his mornings because he had more discipline than you. He sealed them because someone, long before him, in a tradition even older than his own kingdom, recognized that the first minutes after waking were not neutral ground and decided that recognition was worth building a structure around. You inherited the vulnerability, whether you wanted it or not, every single night. 1/60th of death, the text calls it. What you were never properly handed down was the door. Before we close, I want to ask something of you directly, because this channel only exists because people choose to keep it existing. Everything I have shared here, the Talmud, the Zohar, my father's hidden notebook, took months to trace properly, cross-referencing texts across 3 languages, and it costs real time to do that kind of work honestly, rather than pulling a quote from somewhere and hoping it holds up. If this reached you this morning, if any part of it named something you have felt but never had words for, consider leaving a super thanks on this video. It is not a request I make lightly, and it is not for me alone. It funds the next archive trip, the next manuscript request, the next months spent making sure what reaches you is real and not invented. You are not simply watching a video. You are, in a small but real way, becoming part of the reason this research continues to exist at all. So tomorrow morning, before your feet touch the floor, before your hand finds your phone on the nightstand, pause, seal your hands, seal your first word, seal your steps, not as a task on a list, but as a door closed on purpose, the way a wise king once closed it, quietly, before anyone else in the house was even awake to see him do it. Tell me in the comments, which of the 3 seals surprised you most, the hands, the word, or the steps? And if you have ever woken up with that specific heavy weight on your chest before your feet even touch the floor, tell me about it below. I read every one of them, and more often than you would expect, someone else in the comments has felt the exact same thing on the exact same kind of morning and simply never had the words for it until they read yours.